We're here to celebrate the publication of Joseph Ellis's The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution, 1783 to 1789. And we welcome you again, Joseph Ellis. Joe Ellis has had many appearances at Politics and Prose, and I've been here to many of them, and I had the pleasure of introducing you for Revolutionary Summer just a few years ago. She's a very productive person. And I know you're not supposed to judge a book by the cover, but I want you to note the cover, because this is a mini art museum. And it's Washington, Madison, J. Hamilton, and it is, there are Gilbert Stuart's here, there's John Vanderlyn, there's John Trumbull, who, from the famous Trumbull New England family and all that. And that painting was done after Hamilton was killed in that tragic duel. So I guess it was done from memory. And I'm also struck by your dedication to Pauline Maier. I know many of you have read Pauline Maier, at least the Declaration of Independence, as I have, and other books. And what strikes me in all this, and I'm a footnote guy too, and so I'm just struck by the collegiality that you have with your colleagues, some of whom you don't necessarily agree with, but there is a collegiality of trying to learn from the other and see what it is that each can contribute to the other, that often doesn't take place in academic circles, where there's an effort sometimes of tearing down. So I think this is really, for me, it's a way of dealing with things that are constructive and help for learning. Now, the quartet knew how to use a crisis. No crisis was without an opportunity, as Rahm Emanuel once said, and they helped move the country from 13 separate states to some form of national union. And what's great about, in all of Joseph Ellis's works, there's a part of Founding Brothers that I teach in the work that I do on advocacy, is that these people are not demigods. They're political, and they have their doubts sometimes, and but they never lose their vision or their willingness to act, and that's part of what makes this exciting. And so you dealt with procedure in this. You dealt with the asset of ambiguity. You taught us the unanticipated consequences of the Federalist Papers, this vital propaganda tool, which became something that everybody studies now, and especially PhD students, and people like me who like to talk about faction in some of Madison's work. But you also talked about the importance of understanding democracy and slavery in the context of that time, without in any way on the slavery question ducking the moral question. And so there's a lot in here, and that's one of the reasons we want to welcome you again to Politics and Prose. Let's welcome Joseph Ellis.
Sit there. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, David. It is really nice to be back. I was raised in the D.C. area. Went to school at Gonzaga, but it's so long ago that every time I come back and I don't have somebody to drive me. Today I had my son to drive me. Where's my son? Is he around here? There he is. See that guy back there? That's one of my children. And I get lost. I also feel privileged to be in this venue. I think it wouldn't, it's easy to say it here, but I think I could say it anywhere. Politics and Prose is the #1 authors venue in the United States among And independent bookstores need everybody's support to survive these days. And and the fact that you're here is an indication not just supporting me, but supporting the bookstore. That's a really good thing. What I'd like to do is talk for about 15 minutes, not 15 or 20 minutes, and tell you some stories based from the book, tell you why I wrote it, and devote at least the rest of the time, however much you think is appropriate, to a back and forth. There are some former students of mine around here, like sitting around here these days, and they'll tell you that I prefer a seminar to a lecture. And if we can turn this into a rather large seminar, I think that would be preferable. I'm sure I'm going to say some things that are controversial, and so in the end, history is an argument without end, and not a set of platitudes. And we can have some good arguments. The best conversation, in my view, is an argument. That's the reason I love John Adams, by the way. And I want to begin by asking you a question. And the answer to this question leads us to a series of stories. What is the most famous speech in American history? There are three possibilities. Gettysburg Address, and that's the winner, by the way. There are two others that could make the list. I Have a Dream speech, yes. One more. Washington's farewell address. Why is that not a candidate? It was never delivered. Exactly, you're right. In fact, the other thing is Washington didn't really write it. Hamilton wrote it. It was Washington's ideas. The one that I was thinking of, sir.
Washington's speech to his troops.
That's a good one. It should make the list, but you and I are the only people that know that. Yes.
Lincoln's second inaugural.
That's also that's great. That's probably the greatest. That's the most intellectually significant speech in terms of its coming when it did at the end of the war. Yeah, you're coming up with the one that I was thinking of. There's one more hand up back there. What were you going to say?
JFK's inaugural address.
Yes, that's one I was thinking. The ones you are a more serious audience, and you've come up with some powerful things, but that if this were merely an ordinary group of people, they would vote on JFK's address. If you listen to it now, you think, will we really pay any price? Not really. Okay, what's the first clause in the first sentence of the most famous speech in American history? 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. No, they didn't. That is a lie. It is not true. Now, Lincoln had to lie in 1863 because he had to justify the Union side in the Civil War. And he had the moral right on his side, but he didn't have history on his side. The Confederacy had a stronger argument because in 1776, 407, we didn't create a nation. We created a confederation of sovereign states provisionally united to win the war and then go their separate ways, which is exactly what they did. Okay? Think about this. What was the resolution to break free of Great Britain? July 2nd, 1776, from Virginia. The vote's on the 2nd. The declaration is sent to the printer on the 4th. Nothing else. Why we celebrate the 4th is an interesting question. Nobody signed it on the 4th. Most of them signed it on August 4th. So all these things you'll learn. But what was I saying? Tell me, what was I? Where was I?
You were about to say why they are.
Yeah. The resolution on July 2nd was from Virginia, written by Richard Henry Lee, read as follows: that these colonies are and have every right to be independent states. Think back a little further, from 1765 to 75, when they're making their case against Parliament's right to tax and legislate. What are they saying? Where did they say sovereignty lies within the colonies? In the state legislatures. There is no such thing as the United States of America, and when they create something that calls it the United States, under the Articles of Confederation, which is written in 77 and is ratified by 81, there are things going on there, like the war, that makes it difficult to get ratification. When you said United States, it was a plural noun. The United States are, not the United States is. Got it? Okay. If we're right on that, and we are, I mean, we're not calling Lincoln a liar, okay? We're saying he got his facts wrong for a good reason. But that not only of everything that I said true, the average American in the 1770s, 80s was born, lived out his and her life, and died within a 30-mile radius. They didn't have an identity or an allegiance to anything larger than their community and at most their state. When the Continental Army requested money for troops, for salary, and for uniform, very seldom did the states provide what they were asked to give. And they had to be asked, okay? It wasn't mandatory. States were sovereign on this. By the end of the war, the southern elements of the Continental Army were fighting in loincloths. If Washington had actually got what he wanted in manpower, he would have had an army of 88,000. He said he could have won the war in a year. He never got it. The Continental Army was between 12 and 15,000. Why? Because the states focused their efforts on protecting themselves in the militia. Paid more money to people to serve in the militia than to go to the Continental Army. And that's no choice. I'm not going far from home for more money. Anyway, and then when the Continental Army is going to be dismissed at the end of the war, 1783 from Newburgh, they say, I'm sorry, we got no money for you to pay your pensions. Your salaries for the last 2 years haven't been paid. Tough luck. We don't got it. I mean, it was a disgrace. I mean, the way we treated the Vietnam vets when they came back was a disgrace. This was a bigger disgrace. Basically, the guys that won the war were made beggars. All that is a way of saying that if you believed, well, there is this dead zone in American history between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, between 76 and 87, 88, when the Constitution is written and ratified. It's like a black hole. And most people think, well, we came together to win the war, and then a few years later, abracadabra, we came together to form a national government. And that makes great sense if Lincoln's right, that we are already a nation in 76, but we're not. Indeed, which direction is American history headed throughout the 1780s? I could spell this out, but it's in the book, so you can get it there better. But we're headed towards a Europeanization of the North American continent. We're headed towards the American version of the EU. Okay? And that's the way it's going. The forces are all centrifugal rather than centripetal. There is no popular movement to change that direction. People are content with that. Later on, Patrick Henry in the ratifying convention in Virginia says, suppose we join this thing called the Constitution, and then the people from Virginia, the delegates to the Congress and the 2 senators, all vote against a particular bill, or like a tax, and it passes. We're then being taxed without our consent. You can see the origins of the Tea Party here. Okay? This is where it comes from. It's not democracy, it's a belief that political power and government that's far away can't represent your interest. Okay? It comes from the Anti-Federalist thing. Anyway, that's the way history's headed. There is no popular movement that's going to change it. How's it going to change? One way, we don't like to face this because we're a democracy. In democracies, the best things always happen from the bottom up. Except when the worst things happen from the bottom up. It's going to be top down. It's going to be a limited number of dead white males who are going to decide to force the calling of a constitutional convention, which otherwise would have never happened, set the agenda at that convention in a radical way at odds with the instructions that they've been given from the existent government. They're only supposed to revise the existent government. They say, we're going to replace it. They lose battles in the convention, but it goes to ratification. They set a rule. This is also illegal. According to the existent laws, it would have had to be a unanimous vote for ratification. Now, they're never going to get a unanimous vote because of one state, Rhode Island. Rhode Island will never vote for anything. It's boycotted the convention. It's boycotted the ratification process. They arbitrarily set a 9-vote requirement for ratification. They just made it up. Just takes 9 votes. And that means in the ratification process, the whole game is get to 9. If you can get to 9, it forces the others in. And New York would have never come in, Rhode Island would have never come in, North Carolina would have never come in. Who are the people that do this? Now, I know it's hard to believe this. It was hard for me to believe it. They don't do it all themselves, but the 4 leaders are 4 guys. And they're the guys, they just so happen to be on the cover of this book. And I want to tell you a few stories about them and about Ed to relate here, and then promise to end it, as I said, without being take too long. The one guy in here, I'm putting to the wrong guy. This guy surprised me, John Jay. Now, how many of you never heard of John Jay? Okay, you know why you heard it? Because John Jay College for Criminal Justice. No? Yeah. This is an unrepresentative group. I've been through lots of venues. You guys are better than most of the other people. John Jay. I think that Jay is going to be, not just because of this book, but because of the papers that are starting to come out now from the University of Virginia Press. He's going to rise to the first rank. Okay? Now it's too late. The mall's already full. We can't find, but there's no more space on the mall. And we got no more space on Mount Rushmore, but maybe the $5 bill or something like that. Let me tell you a story about John Jay, which epitomizes, his correspondence is really great. His letters between him and his wife, Sarah, are almost as good as John and Abigail's letters. They're really pretty good. It's about 1,000 of them, yeah. And it's August 2nd, 1782. Notice how specific I'm being here. It's Paris. Jay is in this big room with this French minister whose name is Aranda. For a while, I thought it was Orlando, and he's the guy that Disneyland is named after, or something like that. It's Aranda. Jay is a member of the American peace delegation to negotiate an end to the war with Great Britain. The other members are Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and it was supposed to be Jefferson, but Jefferson can't get there. And they send a guy called Henry Lawrence. Lawrence, who is a prominent South Carolina guy and was president of the Continental Congress for a while, gets captured at sea and thrown into the tower. So he can't be there. Adams is up, he's up in Amsterdam trying to get the Dutch bankers to loan us money. And Franklin's got a severe case of the gout. So they say, you got to take care of this, Jay. And so Jay takes care of what he calls the skirmishing business. Why is he talking to the Spanish minister? Because France has a treaty with Spain. France can do nothing without consulting Spain, and this is a biggie, the Congress, Continental Congress, has told the American delegation they can do nothing without the support of France. Why? Because France saved our bacon, okay? Because France made it possible for us to win the war when we did. And Franklin really loves the French. And they love him in all senses of the term. They got a table in which there's a map. And Aranda puts his finger on what is now Erie, Pennsylvania, on Lake Erie. And he goes down through Toledo to a spot that's now Tallahassee, Florida. He draws a line. And he says, everything east of the line is yours. Everything west of the line is ours, Spain's. Jay has not time to call in on his cell phone to find out what the people in Philadelphia would say. This is why you have a lot more authority in the 18th century if you're a diplomat than you did than you do now. All Jay does is put his finger on the Mississippi. He doesn't have to draw a line. He says, that's it, and it's non-negotiable. That's how we get the Transmontane West. That's how the big prize, the big principle in the revolution, in the American War for Independence is independence. The big prize is we get everything between the Alleghenies and the Mississippi. And think about it. We didn't think we were going to get that. Nobody in 1775, 76, we're fighting this war in order to win an empire. We're fighting this war for principle, and for our own sovereign rights as states. So this is like a big deal. And if you think about this, it changes the political chemistry. Once you get this, how can you develop it, regulate it as a confederation? It's really hard because every state's got their own agenda. And how about the states that are landless? Like poor old Massachusetts, like we're over there. I'm from Massachusetts now. And so this affects the chemistry of the situation and makes Jay one of the first people to argue that we need to get rid of the current government, which is inherently dysfunctional, which he says isn't even a government. And he's right. Just to conclude my little sermon, or my little sort of cheering session for Jay, when Jay comes back from Paris, they immediately say to him in the Confederation Congress, the Continental Congress becomes the Confederation Congress after the passage of the Articles, okay, the ratification. They say, we want you to be the head of foreign policy, and they call it superintendent of foreign policy, the equivalent of Secretary of State. And he says, I'm not so sure. And they say, what do you want? He says, well, this man. He says, I don't want to move my family. And then the capital, I know you find this difficult to believe, is in Trenton. It's moved from Philadelphia to Princeton to Annapolis to Trenton. It's a sign that it's really dysfunctional, right? So anyway, He says, the only way I'll do it is if we move the capital to New York. They say, okay. And when Washington is elected president, the first guy he goes to, he says to Jay, he says, what cabinet position do you want? You can have any one. And everybody thinks he's going to say Secretary of State, which would knock Jefferson out. And he says, I want to be Chief Justice. So he does. He doesn't do much as Chief Justice, by the way. Anyway, that's him. Washington. We all know about Washington. The problem with Washington is that he's an icon. He's impossible to get at as a human being. At some point in his life, he leads his life as a monument. He becomes a statue, you know. Really, and it does. If you read his correspondence, he's not writing to anybody except to us, you know. And in the 1780s, after he leaves office, and remember, there's this great moment in 1783 when he surrenders his sword at Annapolis. This is a big deal, okay? Because think about it, Cromwell didn't do it. Napoleon's not going to do it. Stalin's not going to do it. Castro's never going to do it. The only guy that did it is, who's the man from South Africa that did it? Nelson Mandela. Stepped down after leading the revolution. Surrender power. Very seldom. Very seldom. He becomes the American Cincinnatus, the Roman general who walked away, swords into plowshares. Once Cincinnatus goes, Cincinnatus can never come back. You got it? Like, he says, I can't leave, you know, I can't do it. I promised them I was gone. And they want him to come back to lead the Virginia delegation in the Constitutional Convention. If Washington didn't agree, it would have never happened. He legitimized what was of questionable legitimacy. They had tried to do something like this without him earlier at Annapolis Convention. 5 states showed up. He's got these great excuses. You know, my mother's dying, which she was. Took her a while, but she was, yes. I can't come back because of my Cincinnatus thing. I promised the Society of the Cincinnati that I wasn't coming to Philadelphia at the same time, and it would look really bad if I showed up now, having told them that. And he doesn't say this, but you read the letters, you can see it. His good letter, last letter to Lafayette, he says, I am gliding down the stream of life, closer to the end than the beginning. Very soon we'll be entering what he calls the dark mansion of my ancestors. Washington didn't believe he was going anywhere but into the ground. But I have had my day. Now, he knows that no male member of the Washington line in 4 generations has ever lived past their 50s, too. He's 52. So he really doesn't want to do this, like go to Philadelphia. He really doesn't. And later on, no president in American history did not want to be president more than George Washington. God, how I wish for such a creature now. I mean, if you get up and say, I am here to tell you this is the reason why I'm qualified to be president of the United States, in Washington's world, and all the founders' world, you have just announced that you're unqualified. Because you have exhibited a level of ambition incompatible with the kind of commitment to public service and virtue that the office requires. God, I hope, never mind. All right, I'm taking too long to tell you my stories. He does go. He doesn't say much, but he's president of the convention, and that's all important. He legitimizes it. Third guy I'll talk about is Madison. He's really a little guy. He's 5'3", 120. They used to say he was all mind and no matter. When he graduated from Princeton, it was said that he was the smartest guy, but that he wouldn't ever do anything because he wouldn't live long enough. And he always kept to be lingering on the edge of some potential fatality. As it turns out, of all the guys in his class, he outlived them all. And at the end, he's the last of the founders to go to. He dies in 1836. They're all aiming to die on July 4th. Adams does. Jefferson does. Now get this. Monroe does. Madison, July 6th. He misses by 2 days. All right. Madison, I'm going to bring him to you. He's got all kinds of roles in this book. If this were a quartet, were a singing group, he'd be the lead singer. If it was instruments, he'd be the lead violin. I don't know. And the drafting of the Bill of Rights, they don't include a Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. They offer all kinds of reasons for this in the subsequent debates over ratification. Like, well, you only need a Bill of Rights when you have a monarchy, so you define the rights that the monarch can't intrude upon, sort of Magna Carta. So we don't need that because we're not a monarchy. Or if you start to list the rights, suppose you leave some out. That causes trouble too. All that conceals the real reason they didn't have a Bill of Rights. In September 17th of 1787, they were tired and they went home. And they didn't want to do any more. They were just worked out. So at the end of the process, Madison realizes it was a mistake. And the reason he realizes this because 6 of the states that ratify the convention ratify with recommended amendments. I'm going to get complicated here, but I'll try to do it really quickly. Several states say we want to amend what the Constitution says. That's probably a majority position within all the ratifying conventions. Okay, there are 1,648 delegates in 12 states. Most of them say we sort of like this. We like it better than the Articles, but we like to have something different. Madison himself, and how he does this, I still can't understand how he makes this stick. He says to every state, you can't do that. It's up or down. You either got to go with the Constitution or against it, and if you're against it, we're back to the Articles. Oh, shit. Nobody wants to go back there. So then they say, well, how about recommended amendments? He says, okay, as long as you know they're not mandatory. 6 states submit a little over 200 amendments. If you study the 200, as I have, and try to winnow them down so you eliminate duplications, it's 132. How did Madison write the Bill of Rights? Boy, Scalia really needs to look at this, okay? He took the 132 amendments and he said, okay, which of these makes sense for us? And there were some that they all wanted, all 6 states, like requests for taxes would be voluntary. He deep sixed that right away. Okay, that's not getting in there. But to give you a specific example, and he wrote, you can argue he's not the father of the Constitution. There's other people, it's a collective argument. He's the father of the Bill of Rights. He wrote it single-handedly, okay, and ushered it through the House, the Congress, and the Senate. I'm going to give you a loaded example. Second Amendment. Okay? D.C. versus Heller. It's Heller versus D.C., I guess, 2008. The Supreme Court, a 5-4 majority, written by Mr. Scalia, 32-page opinion, ruled that the right to bear arms, as defined by the Second Amendment and as intended in the Second Amendment, was a right with virtually an unlimited right, that not completely, but virtually unlimited right, which is pretty much what the National Rifle Association has been arguing for 20 years. In that opinion, there's no mention of Madison. There's no mention of how the Second Amendment was actually written. Like, this is somebody with, who's operating according to the doctrine of original intent has no inclusion of the person who wrote the amendment. There were 4 states that requested that national defense be in the hands of state militia rather than a professional army. That's what he was responding to. The right to bear arms, in Madison's view, is a derivative right, not a natural right. It derives from service in the militia. Now, we don't have the militia anymore, and the National Guard doesn't quite make it, so it's really an anachronism. But it means to me that, and to me, I mean, if we want to ask questions, the whole doctrine of original intent, which is taken seriously in several reasonably respectable law schools like Yale University, most especially the University of Chicago, once you look at it historically, is totally preposterous. It's not just problematic. It's not just contestable. It's not just we can argue about this. It is ridiculous. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And if you take it seriously, I make following 2 suggestions. The original intent of the 55 people who wrote the Constitution and the 38 who signed it was that not to make the Supreme Court supreme. If you take that original intent seriously, none of these guys have anything to say at all. The second, if you take original intent really seriously, every judge should be a historian, not a lawyer. Okay? I'm ready. Anytime. All right. I've gone on longer than I thought. But, oh, good. This is, hey, there's this book here. And yeah, and I'll read you. Just, this is what, we had Scalia here. He lives somewhere in the city, I'm sure. And does he live in Virginia? Let me. This is what you really need to read to the original intenters. I'm sorry, I can't find. This is Jefferson. Jefferson's officially not a framer. I mean, or he's a founder, but he wasn't president in Philadelphia. He was over in France at the time as minister. But he got asked all the time as he aged, and as they all did, like, what do you think about your generation and blah, 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 blah. And this is what he said. And he did, despite his serious flaws, have a way with words. Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the preceding age a wisdom more than human and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. I knew that age well. I belonged to it and labored with it. It deserved well of its country. But I also know that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him as a little boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. Let's send that to Scalia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. That's a wonderful lead into our seminars. Just marvelous. And I as you were talking, I kept wanting to ask you if, and in the question period, I'm sure you'll get a crack at explaining Hamilton to all of us. And
The reason I didn't talk much about him because Ron Chernow had the good fortune to have somebody find this book and make a whole play about Hamilton that's now going to appear on Broadway, and I'm jealous as the difference.
and it's a sellout on off-Broadway. And but I, as you were talking about Scalia, I kept thinking, geez, if this were an academic setting, Scalia couldn't get tenure for that opinion.
That's correct.
And we ought to play on that, because maybe tenure ought to be looked at for him. There are marvelous things in this book. There's some wonderful quotes from John Marshall, which provide great perspective on democracy and the ratification process. And so let's open it up to questions. You know the procedure. This is being filmed. Others who can't be here will be able to watch it, live stream it, and it's being recorded. Please use the microphones, and we'll rotate the microphones. And if you don't mind, if you're comfortable, it's a public meeting, say your name. Andrew?
Andrew Reamer. Thank you, David, for saying my name. Andrew Reamer. I'm a research professor at George Washington University. Two questions. One is, I read the preface of your book as far as I got it, but you mentioned the notion that the Constitutional Convention and the ratification itself some people can be considered slightly illegal. That's the term you used. So I'm curious, in that period of 1788 to 1791, to what extent were the Anti-Federalists making that argument about the questionable legality?
They made it. Most of the Anti-Federalists made the argument in the ratification conventions, and they lost.
Okay.
And so there was a movement called the Second Convention movement within the losers to say these amendments that we suggested need to be adopted, and if they're not all adopted, which is impossible, we're going to move for a second convention, which is the end of it all. Meaning, if you go to a second convention, you're going to undo everything they've accomplished. Patrick Henry's in favor of that. George Clinton, the governor of New York's in favor of that. They just lose. They lose numerically in the vote, and so they give up. Although, what Madison's doing in writing the 10 Amendments, the Bill of Rights, is saying we're going to co-opt them. By doing something to listen to their previous advice, we co-opt those people who are otherwise going to try to undo our good deeds.
Much smaller question. My understanding is at the beginning of the Constitution, originally it read "We the States" rather than
good.
We
You
the
asked
people.
me great questions. This is another thing that happens, and it's one reason why you could argue that Madison's not the father of the Constitution. The guy who has some claim is some guy that I forget. You guys are really well informed. Gouverneur Morris. Okay. Peg leg guy. Despite that, quite a ladies' man. Exactly the same torso as George Washington. In fact, the statue of Washington in front of the Virginia state capitol of Washington, the face is Washington's from a Houdon face mask, the great French sculptor. The body is Gouverneur Morris because he was in France and they did, never mind. But anyway, in August of 1787, they've got this draft of a document called the Constitution. It's pretty long. It's got like 25 articles to it. And they send it to a committee on style, 7 people. Madison's in there, Hamilton's in there, Gouverneur Morris is in there. And they say, Governor, you do it. This is the single most consequential editorial act in American history about to happen. I'm not kidding, okay? The draft says, we, the people of the states of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, down the Atlantic coast. He just changed it. How does he do it? It's with a pen. We, the people of the United States. The whole debate that's been going on in Philadelphia all summer is about the relative power of the states versus the people as at large. And he answers it rhetorically by himself in the first 3 words that he writes. And nobody said anything because the people outside the drafting committee, I mean, I don't know what they were thinking, like they wanted to go home. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'd like to elaborate on this point that you're making. The preamble says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
Right.
So they had the notion that there was a union, an imperfect union perhaps, but a union. And I think that's a little inconsistent with your argument that they just thought of themselves as 13 separate sovereign
it's a
states.
union of 13 sovereignties.
Well, it says a more perfect union.
Well, the European Union is the union. Right?
Okay, yes.
It makes my point. What's the difference between a union and a nation? We'll spend the rest of the month thinking that one out. And it's a peace pact, really. That's what it is.
Want to get your question in?
Yeah. No, he just wanted to make a comment. That's it?
Well, that's basically it, that I think that presupposes that there was a concept of union, although imperfect.
It is if you look back and impose it, which is what historians often do, and I'm trying to remove that.
Yeah, what was happening between the end of the war and the Constitution? Who was in charge?
I got stories for everyone. You ever hear of a guy called Mo Rocca? Here's a guy that works for CBS Sunday Morning. He calls me up and he says, I just found out that the first president of the United States wasn't George Washington. And I said, that's right. It's a guy called Huntington from Connecticut. And he says, how'd you know that? I said, because I just wrote a book about it. He said, you wrote a book about this? Well, can I read it? Well, it's not out yet, but yeah. And there are about 12 people who are elected president of the Confederation Congress. They have really no power. Think about the word president. What does it mean? Preside. It means you don't really do much. Each state's sovereign. The most interesting thing about the ratification debates, and Pauline Maier is the only person, God rest her soul, the only person who has had the stamina and the wherewithal to study every state. Let me tell you, you can't imagine how difficult that is. It's very hard. And she wrote a book called The Anti-Federalist. But the thing that I argue with her about until she passed was there's a thing called the forest and there's another thing called the trees. And if I want to study every tree, I'm going to read your book. What happens in western New Hampshire in 1787 is really interesting, okay? But the important thing is, what's the pattern? And the big thing is, there is no pattern. Every state is different. Every state thinks in its own terms, and within the state, local groups are thinking in their terms. They cannot have a national conversation. They cannot think nationally. There's no reason to do so, which is my answer to your question.
Can I ask then what made them decide to do a constitution?
They didn't. They were forced into it.
By?
4 guys. Yes, sir.
What made Rhode Island so crazy? Why were they the only
It was
state
always crazy.
that wanted nothing
Back
to do?
in the beginning, it was where Roger Wade, it's where the Massachusetts, have you ever tried, up until recently, have you ever tried, I had a kid go to, that kid right there went to Brown. Yeah, okay. And like you try to get from Boston to Providence, okay? It's really, now it's not hard anymore because you get $4.95. But they used to make it impossible to get from Massachusetts to Rhode Island, because Massachusetts is where you send the dregs of society, where the trash and all the crap that you know, the witches, the Quakers, the antinomians, that's where they go. And so it's always been a place where dissenters flourish. Baptists were dissenters back then. They had some other motives here that because they were a small state, their power in the Articles of Confederation was much greater than was going to be in a national government. They had one vote. Virginia had one vote. Okay? They were also a mercantile state. They were imposing tariffs on Connecticut, Massachusetts to import things to Newport. You know? They were doing good. You know, they had their own local and historical reasons. Sir.
Hi, I'm John Gibson. I want to thank you for bringing the Founding Fathers to life and making them three-dimensional. But even with your books and even with your bringing them to life, it's easy to idealize them and easy to forget that they did create a flawed document, not just practically but morally. And I wanted to ask you, which of the four in this book did the most to advance the interest of slave owners?
To advance the interest of slave owners? None of them did much directly, and Madison indirectly. Madison supported the 3/5 clause. Washington didn't do anything. Both Jay and Hamilton were founding members of the New York Manumission Society. But both of them remained silent. And that's the big problem, okay, that has to be faced. There's no question that slavery is a tragedy. There is no question that slavery was immoral. The question is, what kind of tragedy was it? Was it a Greek tragedy or a Shakespearean tragedy? Was it something that was embedded and intractable, or was it something that could have been ended responsibly by the proper kind of leadership? That's what we should argue about, okay? It's not a moralistic argument, it's really a political argument about what was possible in 1787. Most of the people at the convention thought that slavery was going to die a natural death. Even the ones from South Carolina. They thought the future was on the side of free labor. And there was reason they thought that, because every northern state was ending slavery. Slavery had been abolished in the Northwest Territories. It was going to be isolated in the Deep South. They were going to end the slave trade. They didn't foresee the cotton gin.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to speak briefly to the quality of the Union. In the Boston Globe, there was a very brief article back in the mid-'60s that the state legislature was cleaning up some old bills, and it specified that one of them was from the late 1780s, which made it legal to shoot anyone coming over the border from Connecticut.
A piece of evidence that I will add to my arsenal. Just think if they were coming from Rhode Island. Yes, I think we've got room for maybe one more. Yes, ma'am.
This is our last question.
Okay.
I've often thought that the White House needed an official historian as an advisor. They've got a science advisor and an economics advisor. And
Kennedy had one, Schlesinger.
And I don't know, I've just wondered if you and your circle of historians have ever thought about trying to figure out how to impose more historical accuracy on the perspective of the White House.
No. I mean, I have tried to write stuff, op-edish kind of stuff, arguing that, say, foreign policy decisions in Iraq were made without any sense of the historical context of that region. Vietnam before, yes. I think that any historian that gets assigned to the executive branch is going to be just window dressing. It's not going to make much difference, you know. I think what we need is a series of frontal lobotomies That's all. We're only a few more, and that the people that are actually making, like Henry Kissinger, is historically informed. I don't agree with the way he ends up interpreting certain things historically, but all the time. But he's historically informed, even though he's trained as a political scientist. George Kennan was one of the great foreign policy thinkers who was really historically informed, and the containment theory that he came up with in 45, 46 is brilliant because of its understanding of Russian history. So there are moments. We don't happen to be living in one now, but there are moments when history has made a big difference. I am trying to write, I know I'm becoming too prolific, I'm trying to write, I'm already starting this new thing, and the book is called Now and Then. And it takes 6 contemporary problems, foreign policy, domestic policy problems, and says, to what extent is there any historical wisdom to help us answer these things? Okay? But you really got to be careful when you do that, because the people that usually do that are cherry-picking the past, like the original intent lunatics, okay? And they're only looking for answers that they've already decided upon. You can't do that. You have to privilege the past, not the present. And that's not easy to do, but I'm trying to do that. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Joe Ellis, and we look forward to having you with Now and Then.